Good afternoon, good afternoon. I'm Ryan Martin, the Inclusive Sports Director at the City University of New York Athletic Conference. And today, we are bringing you our latest installment of Talk About It Tuesday. Today, our guest is Zach Ikovich, the Executive Director of the CUNY Athletic Conference. And our goal today is to take your questions and provide the most up-to-date information that we can with all that's going on in our little universe of CUNY athletics here. So Zach, welcome.
Thank you, Ryan. Thanks for having me. We appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone's time who has joined us today.
Great, Zach. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of jump right into this. Can you give us an overall kind of state of affairs right now as to get things started?
Sure. And, this has obviously been, to say it's been a weird year is an understatement for everyone that's gone through this since last March. We're already coming up onto almost a year since we've been without college athletics. It's turned our entire world upside down, not just for the student athletes, but everyone in the CUNY system. Most of us who have been former student athletes, most of us within the CUNY system. So for us, it's been just as painful, if not more so, in trying to come up with ways that we can figure out how to return to sports. And we've been working on that since, last May. First with the fall and now with the winter, and now going forward where we headed with return to sports. So it's been a process, and for the third time, we're hosting these town halls to help clarify some things where we can, to help answer your questions, to be open and transparent about the process that we have to deal with on a daily basis to derive at some of these decisions. We want to be here to answer all of your questions and stay on as long as we need to answer all of your questions. Want to try to keep it, as open as we can, as professional as we can. So we encourage you to ask the questions. There may be questions we don't have answers to, and we'll tell you that, and I'll tell you that. I have my staff on and some of our athletic directors on if they're interested in joining us as a resource. So we appreciate their time as well. I want to let you know that this is our love. This is our livelihood. Nobody wants to have sports more than we do. But it's our obligation as athletic professionals in the CUNY system to make sure that when we do it as safely as possible. Nobody wants to have issues. Nobody wants to have that one case that we have to regret ever wanting to come back sooner than we're ready. And then, the thing that I think most people have learned in the past 10 months is that we're dealing with things that, we've never heard of before. We've never seen before. We have learned more acronyms than we care to ever know again. The WHO, the CDCs, the NCAA, NJCAA, CUNY, all the guidelines you could ever think of. The New York State Department of Health, New York City Department of Health. It's all over the place and all over the map. And we're charged as the athletic administrators to navigate all those waters on your behalf and try to figure it all out and to make sure that we meet all those guidelines that are thrown in our lap, and then marry it together with your desire and our desire to come back and play sports as soon as we can. And there's been so much uncertainty in the past 10 months, and there's so much uncertainty going forward, that the best we can do is try to navigate it together. So that's why we're here. That's why we're here to discuss that with you. And obviously, discuss some real life issues. I mean, this is also an opportunity for every single one of us. Just to share, for me, it's been an opportunity to work from home for the past 10 months and spend a lot more time with my two kids than I would have ever imagined that I could have spent. You know, in times of tragedy and in times of uncertainty, sometimes it's good to have the common denominator of, wow, look what I'm thankful for. I could work from home, and then I have time to spend with my two kids that I couldn't have dreamed of spending this much time with them. So I think we have to find those silver linings in the time of difficulty as well. So let's keep kind of focus on that. And as college students, I think the thing that resonates is that we have an opportunity to get this year back eligibility wise from the NCAA, while also trying to do some things outside of the athletic arena, perhaps focus on our academics, focus on improving our academic record, and then look for those internships, the job and career opportunities that we are coveting after college life. So with that long introduction, Ryan, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll continue on.
Yeah, so I know that we asked on social media, and then we asked the individual athletic directors to try to get some questions to get us started here. And so, thank you for the student athletes at Baruch who sent a few that we'll use to get started. And we welcome anybody who's on this webinar to use the question and answer feature to ask anything you would like to ask during this time. So, Zach, a tough one to start, but there are many students that are considering taking
I'm sorry, Ryan, before you do, I wanted to make sure that I think as important as the questions are, and we want to get to every single one of them, I want to make sure that we also have an understanding of, and I want to be open up front about our return to sports plans and what it involves. A lot of times, you'll hear your athletic directors say that, hey, we have all these things in place that we need to, well, I wanted to kind of outline some of those before we get into the questions, if you don't mind, Ryan.
Sure,
Only because it's important to be on the same page. When we talk about our desire to return to sports ASAP, we are all in that together. But I wanted to also point out some of the realities of return to sports, so that sometimes our student athletes will say, well, I hear excuses about this, that, or the other, and I see some other people playing, why can't we? Well, every state and every city has a different reality and has different regulations to deal with, as do we in New York City, and a city that's maybe hit the hardest, if not one of the hardest in the country and in the world. So I wanted to kind of just go over a couple of points that I asked my staff to put together that we are dealing with collectively on the campuses and at Central in trying to return to sports, and incorporating our team doctors and athletic trainers and athletic administrators to come up with some of these, goals that we need to overcome, and obstacles that we need to overcome. So I'll ask Matt to put some of those up that I've asked them to put together with Mike Sporton from Championships Group. So let's just go through that quickly, and then we could open up for questions. And don't worry, it's not going to cut into our Q&A, because like I said, we'll stay as long as we need to answer your questions. All right, so go ahead, Matt. All right, so the biggest thing that people tie us into is the recommendations that we're getting from the NCAA on the testing and the different sports variety, from low to medium to high contact risk, and what the recommendations are across all of those. Obviously, the thing that sticks out in this conversation is the notion that we need to test every single student athlete at least 3 times a week. We've discussed this on previous town halls about the realities of the CUNY system, where we're not all living in a bubble. We're not living in the same dormitory. We're not living on the same floor per team, where you could isolate folks separately from each other. Where our student athletes, in more cases than not, like the rest of the student body, are commuting. They're going home, they're taking public transportation, they're taking their cars, they're in touch with more people in New York City than they would be in a lot of other places around the country. So the testing piece, while a concern, and certainly it would be very costly for every single department, it's not the be all end all obstacle, but it's certainly one of the major ones. So I wanted to make sure that that's clearly up front. And even though there are recommendations from the NCAA, when the national governing body throws out recommendations, then pretty much every single member listens and tends to follow. And so that's something that we're obviously looking to do on the same level whenever we return to sports. So go ahead, Matt, to the next one. All right, so the pieces that are really areas where we need to dive into a lot more than the NCAA are the regulations that we're getting from New York State, New York City, and CUNY itself. You guys all know that we are 95% online for the spring semester. So that means that there's very, very little traffic on the campuses, and that there's significant protocols for anyone that wants to or even tries to get to your campus that you're so used to going to. So the campus, for all intents and purposes, again, is pretty much closed to most individuals, and therefore we need to go through the testing piece, the screening piece that needs to occur. And then I'm going to ask Mike to talk about some of the New York State guidelines that we need to follow to tie into what each and every campus would have to do whenever they bring student athletes back to campus, if they're brought back to campus when the entire campus is not back for classes in person. So Mike, if you could just please go through some of those New York State guidelines that we have listed, some of them listed here.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I think the biggest point in which Zach alluded to, and not to overgeneralize, and we could take questions later that are more specific, but essentially what Zach alluded to is we're trying to kind of marry not only the New York State guidelines, but obviously guidelines from the NCAA and the SSI. Well, what does that mean for us? And I'm sure that's what you're wondering. From a New York State guideline perspective, although we are uniquely close in geographical location based on our campuses, it also does not play into our favor based on the New York State microcluster scenario. What does that mean? So essentially what that could entail for our campuses would be that as of today, if you've been following Governor Cuomo's updates, as of today, I didn't get today's exact numbers, but over the weekend, let's just say, Manhattan would be in a scenario where our schools in Manhattan would be able to play based on the infection rate in that borough. However, the rest of the boroughs would be shut down, right? So you'd be in a position, let's say at a 4-year level, where the John Jays, the Hunters, the Baruchs of the world would be able to play. But what does that mean? So therefore, in a conference only perspective and or school perspective, those 3 campuses would be able to compete. Now, they'd also have to compete in that borough and that borough alone. So these are just some, and that is just one of the challenges that not only these schools face, but we face in trying to work through not only the guidelines, but then the logistical standpoint of how to implement those guidelines and do it safely with our campuses. So again, not only that, then we go back to the testing standpoint. In a shortened season, and like again, as Zach alluded to, that we're not able to put ourselves and our student athletes in a bubble. How do we work through these testing guidelines between the low, high, and medium risk sports? And as you see on that list in the previous page, that's the way those sports are categorized. But essentially, what does that mean? So the NCAA is recommending the PCR test. That PCR test not only does being able to, I guess the right word would be being able for us to compete. However, the problem is here is that PCR test also has a false positive rate. Now that false positive rate based on the guidelines and New York State guidelines, doesn't allow us to test out of a false positive. So what does that mean? Based on point 2 on the second slide, Matt, what would that do for our campuses? For our big roster sports, so let's say soccer, volleyball, baseball, let's look at those. At some point in a 6-week season, you're almost guaranteed, based on the false positivity rate and the infection rate in New York, to come across some kind of positive test. So how do we work through that? And essentially, the answer is you're not going to be able to test out of that. So any individual that has been or will be around that group of student athletes will have to quarantine for those days as well. I could go on for an hour just on this alone. It's one thing for the guidelines. It's another thing to implement the logistics behind those guidelines. So since May, I have been working together with not only our athletic trainers, our doctors, and our athletic directors to figure out the logistics behind this. The one thing I can tell anybody listening today is that from a medical standpoint, whatever is actually on these slides today can not only change tomorrow, but can change within an hour. So I understand that there's been information that has been as fluid as anything throughout this whole pandemic. But you're going to have to bear with us in the fact that this will change, if not daily, potentially hourly. And I think we definitely need to hammer that point home, that this will change, whether it changes for the better or whether it changes for the worse. You're going to have to stay tuned and make sure that we're all in touch with the fact that this will change and continue to change going forward. Zach, I'll kick it back to you.
Thank you, Mike. I think a very important point also is that we have decided through the athletic director's vote that we were conference-only games for the year whenever we return to sports. So in 2021 academic year, whatever is feasible, whatever may happen, would only be conference games only. So when Mike talks about a 6-week season and potential to shut down for 14 days, you'd pretty much lose a third of your season that's already shortened for conference games only. So that's an important point. Nevertheless, I think the other piece of it in 4 and 5 in facilities and cleanliness, that's buildings and grounds issue on every campus, is ultimately whenever we return, we need the infrastructure of each and every campus to be fully on board with having athletics there and operational, and the needs of athletics through our facilities and through cleaning of our facilities to be an important piece of having everybody on board. And clearly those decisions are made above us in athletics through the president's offices. So every president on every campus in the CUNY system would be making that decision for their campus. We're a conference made up of member schools, and those member schools make their own decisions as to whether they could opt in or opt out. So we could have a scenario where even though we have 8 member senior colleges and 5 member community colleges, at any one of those points, a president of any one of those particular schools may choose to opt out for various reasons. We know that not all of us are created equal. We have campuses with outdoor facilities and without outdoor facilities. We have vertical campuses in Manhattan, but we have horizontal campuses in the other boroughs. So everyone's a bit different. And so therefore, every campus can make their own decisions, and every campus will make their own decisions. We're not going to tell anyone what to do, bottom line. All right, so those are the talking points that I wanted to make sure that you are aware of. Those are the talking points that all of us all the athletic directors, all of us at the CUNY Athletic Conference have been dealing with since March, and trying to figure out to ensure that whenever we do return, it's in the safest possible way and following all the protocols and the obstacles that are placed in front of us. So with that, Ryan, we could move on and go to the questions.
Great, thank you. I think that's really helpful information, everybody, to know to set the context, as we dive into this. So thank you for Thank you for walking us through that. So the first question, I think, and once again, I'm going to start with the list of questions from the student athletes from Baruch, and then happy to go through some of the questions that are in the chat or in the Q&A box here. So, so there are many students considering taking a gap semester or a job offer if there is no spring season. Is it possible to give us information as to whether or not we will be playing prior to the registration deadline?
Prior to the registration deadline for this spring.
I'm assuming for classes is what would be the assumption.
You know, what decisions you guys make individually based on whether campuses are in person or online, that's obviously everyone has the right to make that decision. I would hope that you take your academics as a priority first and foremost, and you know, try to take this time over the past year, if you haven't done so already, to try to under these difficult circumstances help to improve your academics and your career choices going forward. Because once we're done with in Division III particularly, and college athletics in general, once we're done with our college athletics career, it's time to move on to other things besides sports. And 99% of people that played college sports become professionals in something other than sports. So therefore, I think that that's, you know, hopefully the priority for all of you, first and foremost. The decisions on any return to sports is really going to be made by the campus presidents. So I can't answer that question because it's not it for me to answer. It's the CUNY chancellor around each and every president on the campus that's going to make that decision when they're ready to make that decision about when it's safe to return to campuses, and consequently when it's safe to return to sports.
Great. So we're starting to get a few questions here from the folks on the webinar. So we'll start with that. Question here that's anonymous. It says, can we make an announcement about the cancellation of all winter and spring sports? Second, because we're not returning to sports this winter and spring, do you think we will be back? I think that's if we don't return back in spring. Do you think we will be back in fall 21 or spring 22?
Anonymous seems to have a lot of information that the rest of us don't. So no,
Sure.
the only people that will make that decision and will make that announcement are the college presidents and the chancellery. So like last time when Vice Chancellor Batista made that announcement in consultation with the presidents, same thing would happen for anything else that they're ready to make an announcement about.
Okay. When is the deadline to make a decision like this on spring sports? And then are there campuses that have already just clearly, you know, opted out because of the feasibility for them on their individual campus?
Again, I haven't heard a single president opt out of anything as of yet. The decision about winter sports was made on November 23rd. And we know that winter sports typically start on October 15th with basketball. Swimming starts even earlier than that with preseason. So there's a lot of, you know, anticipation as to what's going on because the spring semester is starting in 3 days. You know, if it's up to me, I would have made the decision, you know, by, you know, sooner, even maybe 2-3 weeks ago. But it's not. Again, it goes back to every president is going to make a decision about their campus together with the chancellery when they're ready. And, you know, we'd like to speak to people in power and tell them we'd like to do A, B, and C, but it's really up to them to make an announcement when they're good and ready. Same way they make an announcement about when we're going to return to in-person classes. It's not something that we control, so it's not an answer that I can give you.
Great. You know, and I think some of these questions are going to, you know, we're going to have a similar answer, but I want to ask them just, you know, for the sake of making sure that our students get heard on this one. So
Sure.
what are the main reasons why some of the CUNY schools would be opting out of the spring season? Is there specific things, and maybe some, you know, someone from a campus perspective could explain?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the things that I mentioned are the biggest obstacles. I mean, you could add, staffing and having coaches in place. You could add athletic department personnel that may or may not have been furloughed. You could add a lot of issues that the support levels on campuses need to be in place. You need to make sure that the funding to support athletics in every campus is in place. Think about that Governor Cuomo has withheld 20% of the budget for the CUNY system. So therefore, each school has 20% less to work with at the moment. So there's a lot of factors, but I think personnel and finances and PPE in place is really, really important, along with all the things that I mentioned, all the obstacles we have to go through that I talked about earlier. So there's tons of obstacles, clearly. So we need to make sure that, what's the point of, even if we are going back, that if we don't have our coaches hired and in place and not furloughed, we've seen tons of schools around the country dropping sports, putting their coaches and furloughing them for the entire year, dropping entire athletic programs, firing coaches because they just don't have the funding to keep them on board. For the most part, we have stayed away from, thankfully, all the full-time personnel are still hired in CUNY system that I'm aware of. A lot of the part-time personnel are either month to month or been furloughed. So every campus is a little bit different. But I think that you got to have the infrastructure and support on the campuses to be able to come back. You can't just come back because you want to come back. You need to have all the circumstances and the resources and the foundation in place to give you that level of support. When you just look at the cleaning of facilities that needs to happen before, during, and after a contest or a practice alone, tells you the kind of personnel that you need to in place just to run a practice. So I think that there's a lot of things that need to be in place before we could even talk about, having student athletes back practicing, for example, or competing.
Gotcha. Okay. So in line with that, do the presidents have a deadline of when they decide if we're having a season or not? And can CUNYAC as a conference help pressure or urge them to make a decision?
We could kindly ask, and that's what we've been doing. We'll continue to kindly ask. I know athletic directors are doing the same, trying to make a decision sooner rather than later. I know your first question was about any student athletes that wanted to take a semester off. The school starts on Friday. The opportunity to opt out of classes to get your 100% refund is on Thursday. The presidents are well aware of that. We're all well aware of that. We're not trying to prolong the decision, but again, it's not in our hands. It's not something that, you could say, hey, Zach, make this decision ASAP. I need to know. I'd love to, but it's not in our control. It's in the control of the presidents and the chancellery, and they're going to make that decision when they're ready to make that decision. Because you got to remember all the things that I talk about. The athletics doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's with all the other campus support pieces that need to be there. And they have to look at the whole big picture together in order to make that decision.
Okay, great. So this is from another student who's with us right now. It says, for those of us who do not have financial aid, our tuition as CUNY students has not changed. We are paying the same price as if we were on campus. Why is a financial issue being raised if we haven't been on campus in a year?
I haven't raised a financial issue. I think that every campus has different circumstance. Again, every president controls their budget on their campus. CUNY doesn't tell them what to do with their budget. So if they've been given 20% or less resources, then that's something that they have to work on internally. So that may be a question internally for each and every campus, because everyone is somewhat different. So we haven't, I think our priorities, and if you could see from the talking points that we had up front finances were not part of the talking points. Even though it's a consideration for sure, even though coaches being on staff and athletic department personnel being on staff is a concern for sure, it's not one of the talking points that we discuss, because there are other things that need to happen before we even get to finances and get to the personnel, which is NCAA, NJCAA, state and city regulations that you have to follow before you can talk about sports.
Okay. So another student-based question it asks, have you considered the possibility of not limiting play to conference only? By local non-conference teams, you could fill your schedule with enough games without having to leave your borough.
We have discussed every scenario possible. I think that when the circumstances are such that we can have sports and we could play sports and all the things that we have on our checklist are checked off, I don't think that the athletic directors are looking for obstacles and who not to play. If there's a school in Brooklyn like St. Joe's that you can play, there's a Pratt, there's a Mount St. Vincent in the Bronx. If we're back playing and competing, and I don't think any one of us is concerned about who to compete against. And if we can compete against our own CUNY schools, then we can compete against others. I think the only caveat to that is that they're following similar or same protocols that we are, and that they're doing it safely. There's a lot of schools rushing to get athletics back because they need to keep the doors open, because 80% of Division III are small privates with less than 2,000 students. So if they have 400 or 500 student athletes, as most of them do, out of 2,000, that's a huge population that they need to keep on campus to keep their doors open. Thankfully, that's not our situation. We're not reliant on student athlete enrollment to keep our doors open. And that's why a lot of things are still in place where they're not elsewhere. But nevertheless, we want to get back to sports first. We could talk about who we're competing against.
Great. Another question from a student here. We have been in lockdown for almost a year at this point. How are schools not already aware of the capabilities, funding, et cetera, and ready to jump into a spring semester? And it's a two-part, and I'll just give you the second part right now. It says, Zach, and if CUNYAC has no say in the decision to play in spring, what is the point of this meeting, or why aren't we speaking directly to our school reps?
I'll start with the last one first.
Sure.
The point of this meeting, as has been the point for the last two town halls, is to answer questions from student athletes directly and be accessible and available to our student population to ask the question. That doesn't mean that you're going to get a different answer than what you're getting on your campus, or you're going to get the same answer that you're getting. My point is to be available to you to answer these questions. Whether you like my answer or not, I'm going to be here to help to answer them. So I'm not here to discuss the spring classes and spring semester. I'm here to discuss any and all questions that you have. And if your questions are because spring semester is starting in 3 days, and because men's volleyball season, for example, would have already started and what's going on, I get it. I get the anxiety, and I'm trying to help to answer your questions as best as I know them. You should be speaking to your schools directly. That should be your first point. Any one of you, that's where you should be going to. I'm here to help answer questions that you may not have gotten an answer from somewhere, that might have fallen through the cracks, that we don't want to be not available to you. I'd rather be available to you to help clarify some things where we can. There'll be areas where I won't be helpful to you. You may want an answer that I cannot provide. That's going to be part of the conversation. I'm okay with that. I hope that you are too. All right. They're all aware of, as to the first question, they're obviously all aware of the capabilities of funding, but it's not completely up to us, as I alluded to from the get-go. The New York State guidelines alone, if you just follow Governor Cuomo's state of the state addresses, I mean, they're changing every day. When we have the most cases in New York State, he's saying now, open up the restaurants, open up the businesses. When the cases were significantly lower, he was shutting it down. We don't know where it's going, but it's coming from a higher authority. You have to follow them. We're aware of our capabilities, but we can't control what's coming to us from elsewhere. So the NCAA mandating 3 tests a week, recommending 3 tests a week is coming from a higher authority. That's not something we control. We have to adapt, and our return to sports protocols from our medical group is doing that, is adapting to what the protocols are coming from above. So it's not that we don't know what we have, it's that we just don't know what's coming up from other areas that we have to follow. Hopefully that answers those multiple questions.
Yeah, it does. Just seems like a lot of frustration from our student athletes, which I think we can all relate to on this. So we appreciate you taking the time to answer these questions. So this is just kind of a summary question, and I'm just going to kind of paraphrase a little bit. The student is asking that, I guess confirming that you feel the best avenue for the student athletes to air their grievances is to reach out to their own ADs and presidents. And that's
the
I'm
one
trying
thing,
to soften this
the
question.
one thing that I will ask, the one thing that I will ask all attendees is, and I'm not telling you not to be anonymous, but I would suggest that you put your name to it. There's no repercussions to stating who you are. I want to make sure that it's our own student athletes, our own personnel asking the question, as opposed to someone that's logging on that may not be. So I would ask you that. That's your choice. Your question is about, yes, you absolutely need to be talking to your folks on locally. That's where the decisions are made for your campus. Your president has the purview of what the situation is on your campus to best answer the question about your campus. Your AD knows your athletic department better than I'll know it or anyone else. So yes, you absolutely should be talking to them. That doesn't mean that there aren't questions and answers that we can't provide that they can't. So it's good to be informed from different areas and different avenues. Same like I don't need to read the same thing over and over. I could get my information from multiple sources. We're just another source that helps you to answer your questions. And whether you choose to be on here or not, or just discuss it locally with your president and with your athletic director, that's your choice. We're just trying to be here as a resource.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. So this question from Julia Catone. Julia, I hope I got your name right. Is there any way we can set up a call with the chancellor or college presidents?
I'm actually the Chancellor Matos Rodriguez has expressed interest in talking to the student athletes at some point. I'm hoping during the month of February. Whatever the fallout that comes from with sports and a return to sports. So that's something that we are working on. I hope that he will be able to do so and that we can make an announcement pretty soon. So I can't talk about your college presidents. That's something you probably have to, you have a better chance of going to your president or through your athletic director directly. I would ask your athletic director first and see if that's a possibility as student athletes on your campus to do that. But I'll work on the chancellor part and get back to you. And I'll get back to you on that piece. Thank you, Julia.
All right. So I guess this question is asking what is the level of support from all the different schools in the conference, and if one school opts out of the season, does that mean the conference isn't able to function, or how many teams need to buy in?
Sure. For our AQ, so for the sports where we have automatic qualification to the NCAA tournament, we need 4 schools to opt in. So out of 8 schools, we need 4, and we still keep our AQ. So we don't need everyone to opt in. At the community college level, it works through the region. So as many schools are involved, they'll find competition within the region. From the conference standpoint, we'll look to work with any and all schools, whether it be 4, 5, 6, whatever it is. We'll hold competition for them. We'll hold the conference championship for them. If it's less than 4 teams, then I've expressed my desire to the athletic directors that we will still look to hold events for the schools that are opting in and competing. And if they're not competing, if it's only if we're allowed to have scrimmages, if we're allowed to have CUNY only competitions, whatever we're able to do to keep our student athletes active and engaged and playing the sports that they love and representing their school, we're here to support.
Okay, great. That's a good way to put that, Zach. So I'm getting some questions from just different students in regards to vaccine, and I know there's a lot of ambiguity to vaccines. So I don't want to take you down a rabbit hole, but I think it's important to kind of address that, and as the the potential hope that everybody thinks the vaccine is going to provide, if you don't mind. So first one, do vaccines being on the market lower the number of obstacles to return to spring sports competition? And does that affect CUNY's decision going forward in any way?
I think that we have a lot of, as I said earlier, we have a lot of things to overcome before we even discuss the vaccine. And the vaccine is something that's obviously pretty new in the implementation stage. So therefore, we've yet to see what that would look like going forward. So I don't want to presume to know the answer to that. I think that we would have to probably wait and see what the impact is overall and how many people are taking it and not, et cetera. So there's a lot of factors to contribute. It could potentially help, but I think it's still too early, and I don't want to pretend to know what the outcome is going to be. But I'm hoping that will help us get back sooner.
Okay. So we don't have any other questions in the chat, and so I know we've had you on the firing squad for a little bit, and so we do appreciate your candor and speaking for the students, as an advocate and trying to keep them in the loop as much as possible with all this uncertainty. So why don't you go ahead and give us some of your closing thoughts, and then we'll wrap up for today's town hall.
Well, as you know, also, Ryan, we've been so eager to get all of our sports back on track, and this was supposed to be year 1 of our wheelchair basketball team competing against the likes of Alabama and Nebraska and Arizona. So there was a lot of expectations heading into this year. But at the same time, we're looking to use this time and have used this time to look at some of the things that we could continue to improve within the CUNY system. We have a awesome new chancellor. The person that I report to, Vice Chancellor Batista, is a former student athlete and baseball player at Division I St. Francis. So we have people in the CUNY system, including a bunch of new presidents, who are very, very supportive. And it's unfortunate that in basically, in year 1 or second year of their tenure, we had to be hit with a pandemic that basically stopped everything. So I think it stopped our progress and stopped where we wanted to go. But I think we're going to use this time wisely to regroup and come back stronger as soon as we're given the green light to do so.
Okay, great. Zach, we've got a few different messages coming in saying thank you for your time and all that sort of stuff like that. So I want to make sure everybody's really appreciative for you jumping on, even though this isn't the easiest conversation to have. One last question I think is probably important to ask, and then we'll wrap things up for today. It says, as a follow-up to the question about getting a meeting with the chancellor in February, does that mean a decision won't be made until then?
No, I think it has nothing to do with the decision. The chancellor expressed an interest in being available to talk to the student athletes and answer your questions. So I don't think the two have anything to do with each other as far as a timeline.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much to all of our folks who tuned in today. As always, you can submit questions via CUNYAC social media, and we can address this as well in future town halls. We realize that everybody is kind of frustrated where things are, but from a conference perspective and our individual campuses, we are doing all we can because we all have the same goal of returning our student athletes to their sport and on campus safely, and as as quickly as possible. So, Zach, thank you for your time. Mike, thank you for your time, and students and coaches and athletic directors, stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. All the best to everyone. Thanks for your time.